Hello everyone, and welcome from a beautifully bright, wintry Oxford to all of you joining us today to explore Iain McGilchrist's seminal book, The Master and His Emissary. The Silence Hub has been a little silent of late, though in the first lockdown we did issue a series of 4 podcasts about poetry in silence, which you can find a link to on our web pages. In Trinity term, all being well, we are putting on our Silence in Syria programme based at the Bodleian Library, so please look out for details of that. My colleague and Silence Hub co-convener Willem Kuyken is going to introduce our distinguished guest and his book. You'll see Willem on the screen at the moment, and also the other Silence Hub convener, Miriam Kalaija. Willem is Ribtlat Professor of Mindfulness and Psychological Science in the University of Oxford, and his most recent book is Mindfulness, Ancient Wisdom Meets Modern Psychology with Christina Feldman. So I will hand over to Willem now.
Thank you, Kate, and I'd like to add my warm welcome to everybody. And in the tradition of the Silence Hub that the 3 of us have convened, we are going to start the session with some silence. So there's no Zoom malfunction. This is a very deliberate and intentional movement into silence. And maybe just as we move into silence, just kind of noting the kind of weather pattern of your mind and body just now. And just letting yourself fall into and rest into silence, and indeed the experience of silence. Thank you. So, Justine, if we can just bring Iain onto the screen, I'd like to introduce Iain McGilchrist, who is, I'm going to keep my introduction very brief because I think we're all here because we want to hear from Iain and from his book, but just a few words of introduction. Iain's a former fellow of All Souls College here at Oxford. And he started his life out here at Oxford as an English professor, but retrained in medicine and then went on to retrain in psychiatry. And he has many accolades, which I'm not going to go through, and you can find those on the website that was part of the sort of link for this session. But suffice it to say, I think, in my view, and I think in the view of many people, Iain is one of the most innovative thinkers, I think, in the world, and in fact in modern history, around the way the mind and the brain operate in the wider context of the world and in the wider context of history. He told us just before we started, he's going to be reading today from his very seminal book, The Master and His Emissary, and he told us just before we started that he has just delivered the manuscript for his new book with the provisional title, The Matter with Things. Apparently it's 2,250 pages long, longer than the King James Bible, and there may be some editorial the dialogue that goes on with him and his publisher in the coming months. The format we're going to follow is that in a moment you'll see Kate, Miriam and I disappear off the screen, and Iain will read 4 extracts. We hope to get through 4 extracts from his book. He will read, and they'll perhaps if he chooses to say something about the reading that he's just read. And after each extract, I'll see what the time is and see how many questions there are time for after each extract. If you have a question which comes to you as Iain's reading and speaking, please use, you'll see on the bottom right of your screen, the Q&A button. Please use the Q&A button, and we will select from the questions there the ones that we feel are of widest interest to everyone and that we have time to answer. I don't want to be overly controlling, but my suggestion would be not to use the chat too much amongst delegates. I just think it's a distraction from the very rich readings and discussion that we're about to enjoy. I think that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction, and over to you, Iain.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and for those very kind and generous words. I'm going to try and leave as much possible time for discussion, so I'll keep comments to a minimum, but I think the first piece does require some introductory comment. It's my attempt to explain something about the way in which the world comes into being for each one of us, that it's not just something we make up, but it is also something that we help to mold. And keeping those two positions in mind at the same time is important. And the image that came to me was one to do with the way a landscape is formed and the way in which a landscape forms a river. And these images from landscape are very important for me because I live on the Isle of Skye. So whenever I'm looking for an analogy, it tends to lead to meditating on the landscape. This is from pages 230 to 231. The feeling we have of experience happening, that even if we stop doing anything and just sit and stare, time is still passing, our bodies are changing, our senses are picking up sights and sounds, smells and tactile sensations and so on, is an expression of the fact that life comes to us. Whatever it is out there that exists apart from us comes into contact with us as the water falls on a particular landscape. The water falls and the landscape resists. One can see a river as restlessly searching out its path across the landscape, but in fact no activity is taking place in the sense that there is no will involved. One can see the landscape as blocking the path of the water so that it has to turn another way, but again the water just falls in the way that water has to, and the landscape resists its path in the way it has to. The result of the amorphous water and the form of the landscape is a river. The river is not only passing across the landscape, but entering into it and changing it too, as the landscape has changed and yet not changed the water. The landscape cannot make the river. It doesn't try to put a river together. It doesn't even say yes to the river. It merely says no to the water, or does not say no to the water. And by its not saying no to the water, wherever it is that it does so, it allows the river to come into being. The river does not exist before that encounter. Only water exists before the encounter, and the river actually comes into being in the process of encountering the landscape with its power to say no or not say no. Similarly, there is whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, but whatever it is that exists only comes to be what it is as it finds out in the encounter with ourselves what it is. And we only find out and make ourselves what we are in our encounter with whatever it is that exists. So that's the first reading.
So the format is, if people would like to ask questions of Iain from that reading, please use the Q&A box just now. And just whilst we're waiting for the questions, Iain, maybe I can ask a question about when you use in that reading the expression say no in the context of will. What are you meaning?
Well, I've come to the conclusion, it would take me a while to explain why, but let me just say that I think that negation is absolutely essential to creation, that some element of resistance is how everything comes into being, and may indeed be the whole reason that there is a differentiated cosmos at all. And I was taking a hint there from the philosopher Max Scheler, who pointed out that the elements in the human psyche, which he differentiated as Drang and Geist, can't say yes to something because it isn't already there. It only comes into being through their encounter with it. So they're not in a position to say yes to it because it doesn't yet exist. All they can do is either say no or open what I would call an active receptivity. In other words, not say no. And I think that idea of active receptivity in relation to both the world, to other human beings, and to works of art is a very important concept. And I'm sure with your knowledge of and expertise in mindfulness, you will understand what I'm talking about.
So I'm going to take the question from Stephen Sproats, which is, in the reading, is water analogous to undifferentiated awareness?
Yes, I think that's right. It is. I'm not sure that I meant exactly awareness, but it is whatever it is that is undifferentiated at the point of encounter, but has a potential. So water has a potential to be a river, but at the moment of encounter, it isn't. So yes, our awareness is like that, and our awareness can be shaped. In fact, I have written a very long piece in this book, new book, about the relationship between consciousness and matter. And I'm very taken with William James's concept that the thisness of William James is like the vocal cords when air passes over it. The air is absolutely formless and has no specific meaning, but his vocal cords can turn it into the utterance of William James. So in a way, that's another example of how resistance shapes something and brings it into being. It's very like sculpture, in which, you know, we cut away things in order to reveal something. We don't put it together.
I think we can take the other question as well, which is from an anonymous attendee. Does this mean that you resist either both a realist position and a constructivist position?
Correct. Okay. I do. I think that we play a part in whatever it is that come into being. And I do reject both the naive realist view that there just is a reality out there with a capital R-O-T, which, by the way, spells rot. And I also resist the constructivist idea that we miraculously we make it all up by ourselves, M-U-M-B-O, mumbo. So I don't like either of these positions. I think that we take part in what is, but that doesn't mean we make it out of nothing. There is something, I believe, that is there that we must be receptive to and responsive to, and it in turn is receptive and responsive to us. The best expression of this in philosophy that I know is in the philosophy of A.N. Whitehead.
I'm going to take just the one final question that we've got, and then we're going to move on, because we have very deliberately selected 4 quite varied readings, and I think they will offer different things to different members of the audience. So the last question I'm going to take before we move on is from Anne Hamlin. What you describe seems to have some relationship to Gestalt psychology's concept of figure and ground in phenomenological experience generally, and visual graphic art more specifically. Do you have any thoughts around that?
I do. I have lots of thoughts around that, and you're bang on target. Unfortunately, I don't have time to say very much, except that in both The Master and His Emissary, and perhaps even more in my new book, I do explore the very, very important central idea of the Gestalt and the difference between figure and ground, which also relates to the different ways in which the 2 hemispheres function. There's an awful lot in your question, but and I can't unpack it all now, but if you're interested, then keep watching this space, so to speak.
Right. So thank you, Iain. So let's move on to the second reading.
Okay, so this second reading is from pages 28 to 29. Attention is not just another function alongside other cognitive functions. Its ontological status is of something prior to functions and even to things. The kind of attention we bring to bear on the world changes the nature of the world we attend to, the very nature of the world in which those functions would be carried out and which those things would exist. Attention changes what kind of a thing comes into being for us. In that way, it changes the world. If you are my friend, the way in which I attend to you will be different from the way in which I would attend to you if you were my employer, my patient, the suspect in a crime I'm investigating, my lover, my aunt, a body waiting to be dissected. In all these circumstances, except the last, you will also have a quite different experience, not just of me, but of yourself. You would feel changed if I changed the type of my attention. And yet nothing objectively has changed. So it is not just with the human world, but with everything with which we come into contact. A mountain that is a landmark to a navigator, a source of wealth to the prospector, a many-textured form to a painter, or to another the dwelling place of the gods, is changed by the attention given to it. There is no real mountain which can be distinguished from these, no one way of thinking which reveals the true mountain. Science, however, purports to be uncovering such a reality. Its apparently value-free descriptions are assumed to deliver the truth about the object onto which our feelings and desires are later painted. Yet this highly objective stance, this view from nowhere, to use Nagel's phrase, is itself value-laden. It's just one particular way of looking at things, a way which privileges detachment, a lack of commitment of the viewer to the object viewed. For some purposes, this can be undeniably useful, but its use in such causes doesn't make it truer or more real, closer to the nature of things. Attention also changes who we are, we who are doing the attending. Our knowledge of neurobiology, for example, of mirror neurons and their function, and of neuropsychology, for example, from experiments in association priming, shows that by attending to someone else performing an action, and even by thinking about them doing so, even in fact by thinking about certain sorts of people at all, we become objectively, measurably more like them in how we behave, think, and feel. Through the direction and nature of our attention, we prove ourselves to be partners in creation, both of the world and of ourselves. In keeping with this, attention is inescapably bound up with value, unlike what we conceive as cognitive functions, which are neutral in this respect. Values enter through the way in which those functions are exercised. They can be used in different ways, for different purposes, to different ends. Attention, however, intrinsically is a way in which, not a thing. It is intrinsically a relationship, not a brute fact. It is a how-ness, a something between, an aspect of consciousness itself, not a whatness, a thing in itself, an object of consciousness. It brings into being a world, and with it, depending on its nature, a set of values. So that was the second one. You're mute, Willem. I can't hear you.
Thank you, Iain. Just while we wait for the questions to come in, I'll just ask one of my own, if I may. I've always found that section of the book very moving because it has such practical utility. And I wonder what you think of and I know you too have lots of thoughts about the way your ideas apply in the wider world. When people talk about things like the attention economy, and they talk about ways in which our attention is no longer in our own voluntary control, is being hijacked by other agendas. Do you have any thoughts about how that reading relates to those wider questions?
Well, yes, I do very much, because as you see, I think attention is foundational. It's central to the idea of love, which in a different kind of cosmology would also be thought of as foundational and creative. And when our attention is squandered and snatched, it's a form of robbery. It's a form of debasement. And it actually impoverishes the kind of world we live in and who we take ourselves to be. So I do take the issue of attention enormously seriously. And it worries me that in some ways, measurements seem to suggest that people are much less willing to devote long, serious, slow, deep attention to things that merit it. Because in my view, everything that matters only reveals itself if you pay that kind of attention, not the quick and dirty sliding over the surface kind of piecemeal attention.
There's a question from Kate, Kate McLaughlin, my peer on the Silence Network. Coming at this from a literary angle, I'm reminded of Shelley's views on empathy, influenced by Shaftesbury. How does the imagination interact with attention?
Gosh, that's a huge and very good question, Kate. I think the attention is a way in which the world is revealed to us, and imagination is necessary for the world to be revealed to us. So attention always involves an aspect of imagination. When I gave those examples of the different ways in which a mountain can be seen, in a way you could say it is imagined differently by each person who approaches it, which of course doesn't mean that everybody sees completely conflicting things. They see things that imagination isn't fantasy. Imagination doesn't take us away from reality. Like Coleridge, I see imagination as the way in which we actually get access to reality. And it is imagination through which the world finally speaks to us truly. So rather in opposition to a current, misconception in many quarters, imagination is something that we need in order to be able to see things, in order to be able to understand things. It's not a luxury, and it's certainly not a distraction.
Thank you. Moving across to one of the attendees, an anonymous attendee. Please, could you comment on the relationship between what you're describing and Buddhist views on dependent coarising and the emptiness of how experience appears?
I will have to do that quite briefly because it's another wonderful, I mean, they're all fantastic questions. They're all on the money.
Iain, do you want, I'm just aware that many of the delegates won't know what Buddhist co-arising means. So if you could just say a word or two about that before answering the question.
Well, I'm not a Buddhist, so I may misspeak here, but if you'd like to speak for me, I mean.
No, I'm not.
my understanding is that our consciousness and the conscious cosmos generate whatever is together. And it's a kind of interdependent relationship. In fact, there's a wonderful book by Kriti Sharma called Interdependence, which is about life and about biology. She is a molecular biologist, and she writes wonderfully about the way in which things come into being, not by first one affecting the other and then the other affecting the one, although that's an advance on the idea that we just receive things or just push things out there. It's not necessarily reverberative. At one and the same time, each party in this interdependent relationship is bringing the other into being. And in fact, that's a commentary on Heraclitus as well, that it's not now this, now that. It's that at the same time, the two opposite things are bringing one another into being. Now, I rather like Monsieur Jourdain in Molière's play Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, who was amazed to discover that all his life he'd been speaking prose. I discovered that all my life I've been a Buddhist without knowing it. The Buddhists sort of beat a path to my door. And I find I have wonderful conversations with them because effectively I invented the wheel the hard way and realized actually out of a background very much in the Western tradition, how consonant that thinking out of that tradition can be with Oriental traditions such as Buddhism, particularly Zen and Taoism. For me, they are very important.
So But there's a question from John Dunson, which actually, John, we're going to come to your question with one of the next readings. It actually is rather presciently, you've got a question that relates to a reading yet to come. So we'll come to that a bit later on. But we'll just finish with one from Miriam, which is, she starts with, it's a simple question, which is, let's see whether you agree. Is praying a form of attention for you? I'm thinking of the poem by Mary Oliver, Praying, which ends with the following line: into thanks and a silence in which another voice may speak.
I like that very much. Incidentally, I like Mary Oliver very much. Her poetry, at any rate. I don't know her, if she's still alive. But yes, very much so. I mean, I think that is right. It is a matter of audition. There's a marvelous passage from Steiner's Real Presences about, in fact, about the Annunciation and about Mary receiving what the angel says. And in a way, that is a marvelous image of prayer. And since I've just got a second, I hope, I just want to say there was a second part to the previous question, which was about emptiness. And I just want to gloss that very briefly. I've come to realize the meaning of the idea that emptiness is inordinately rich. I mean, one can think of silence as a form of emptiness that allows things to come into being. But it's become clear to me that that idea, which is expressed in the idea shunyata, it is not just an emptiness, but a field of infinite potential, rather like the swelling seed, which has a space in it out of which the germ can grow, and the womb out of which the child can grow. So that's the way in which I see emptiness. As rather, as I said, negation is extraordinarily creative, so is emptiness, but it's not emptiness in the way we often think of it, nor is the negation in the way we often think of it.
Thank you. Let's transition into the third reading.
This is from pages 72 to 73, and I was looking for a way of talking about this interdependence of things and how they co-create one another, and the primacy of relations. In the book I'm writing, I actually adopt the position that relations are prior to relata. They're prior to the things that are related, that come into being out of the web of relationships. That may sound paradoxical, but I think, justify. Music consists entirely of relations, betweenness. That's a word I coined and I use, betweenness. The notes mean nothing in themselves. The tensions between the notes and between notes and the silence in which they live in reciprocal indebtedness are everything. Melody, harmony, and rhythm each lie in the gaps. And yet the betweenness is only what it is because of the notes themselves. Actually, the music is not just in the gaps any more than it is just in the notes. It is in the whole that the notes and the silence make together. Each note becomes transformed by the context in which it lies. What we mean by music is not just any agglomeration of notes, but one in which the whole created is powerful enough to make each note live in a new way, a way that it had never done before. Similarly, poetry cannot just be any arrangement of words, but one in which each word is taken up into the new whole and made to live again in a new way, carrying us back to the world of experience, to life. Poetry constitutes a speaking silence. That's that third passage.
Thank you, Iain, and we can go to John Dunson's prescient question now. Is there a parallel with the context of diatonic harmony that gives meaning to individual notes on a scale?
There is, and harmony, as you may know, was originally not about notes sounding simultaneously. It only started to mean that in the late medieval period, but up until then, musical harmony was thought of as the way in which notes in a melody combine, because after all, rather like a rhyme in poetry where you have one word and then another one that comes later that as it were, harmonizes with it. You can have notes in a melody that reflect what has come before and anticipate what comes after. In fact, that's what a melody is. So what I was really trying to point out is that every individual thing is utterly transformed by the whole that it goes to make part of. And it's every bit as true, in fact, arguably truer, that we can only know the part when we come to know the possible whole that it can belong to, as that we can only know the whole when we know the parts that go to make it up. So that is in a way the clearest image, I think, of why there is something profoundly wrong with reductionism, the idea that if you take things apart, you will have, and then you can put them together again, you will understand what you've got. Music is a complete refutation of this, the most dramatic one I know.
Thank you. There's a question from an anonymous attendee. Can we use this musical analogy for relationships or for love?
100% we can, yes. I absolutely agree with that. I haven't really talked much about the hemisphere hypothesis because it takes too long, and if you're interested, you'll no doubt either have read or will read more about that. But both relationships and the narratives of relationships and the feelings of other people and music are very largely underwritten for most of us by the right hemisphere of the brain. And I think that music is an analogy of this. And it also is a good analogy of how, if you take the idea that a note becomes enriched by the place it takes in the whole that it belongs to, and how the whole can't exist nonetheless without that note doing whatever it does. Relationships, webs of relationships are like this, that there isn't a trade-off, as it were, between me being me and me being in a relationship with another. Through the relationship of being with the other, I become more myself, not less myself. And if the relationship is a good one, the other person becomes more themselves, not less themselves, by being taken up in the relationship. And an image I often use for this is that of two planetary bodies that rotate around one another. The human relationships are in some ways like this, that you don't want these two bodies to fly off into space and have no more to do with one another, but you don't want them to collapse into one another into a state of fusion either. There needs to be, another thing I say is necessary distance, which I think is an important idea, that actually things are preserving their individuality, but enriching it through being part of a whole, only if there is necessary distance. And it's only through having a necessary distance from a work of art, from a person, from the world, that we actually understand it. That's not to say that we are remote from it or alien from it, or adopting an objective stance in some way. No, not at all. It's just like the relationship, that there needs to be space in order to appreciate. If you try to read a book right in front of your nose, you can't read it. If it's too far away, you can't read it either. It needs to be at a certain proper distance.
So we have two more questions. Just to explain to the delegates, the panelists can't post to the Q&A, so I'm seeing two streams of questions. So this is a question from Kate, and I think it's well, I'll just skip the question. Does this spell the end for literary criticism?
No, absolutely not. You may be playfully referring to the fact that in my very early youth, I wrote a book called Against Criticism, but in fact, the book was a work of criticism, so it had a paradox in it. I was saying that what we do in the name of criticism is often very damaging, but that criticism is nonetheless a very important and valuable thing. But what this means is exactly as I was saying, not that you adopt some superior remote position towards the work of art, seeing things that the poor foolish author himself or herself couldn't see, nor do you just simply give yourself up to a sort of wash of feeling, but you are able to, for a period, to look at it rather more critically, rather more analytically, but then that reading must be taken back into the whole picture. And this is an analogy with music. So if you play an instrument and you like a piece, you may try to play it and find, oh, yes, I really want to play this, but I need to really practice my fingering at bar 20. And you take it apart and you practice bits and you see the harmonic structure. But when you come to play it, you must put all of that out of your mind. It would be fatal if you thought about it. But it's not that the time has been wasted. The time has not been wasted. It has resulted in a beautiful performance. Now, the difficulty with literary criticism is when you end up feeling clever about your remarks at the expense of the work of art, whereas all that should be happening in criticism is that the critic should be self-effacing, should be opening up the other mind to the beauty of what is there. And that is criticism. That is very valuable. But at the end, it has to come back and be integrated into a reading of the poem, which just is a reading of the poem. And I think that reading poems can be a criticism in itself. At the moment, I'm reading a series of poems every day on YouTube. I've done about 220 so far. And I think that reading, something I learned through very good teachers at Oxford, reading a poem can be a way of criticizing it.
Thank you. Maybe the last question before we move on to the next reading, from SG. Could you speak a bit more about poets whose work particularly embodies the idea of a speaking silence? For instance, by obliterating language using visual means, as Susan Howe does in That, This.
Well, yes, I suppose what I would say is that I don't see that particular techniques or styles exemplify it. It's just that, as it were, the poem, a great poem, says so much. And yet when you try to paraphrase it, it says almost nothing at all. And therefore, what I'm really saying is that the thing that speaks is so great, so implicit, so contextual, so embodied, that when you disembody it, decontextualize it and make it explicit, you've lost it. That was why I wrote against criticism. And that's why I went off from Oxford and studied medicine to get a better understanding of the mind-body relationship. But I think all poetry is a speaking silence. And in fact, in the book I just referred to, Against Criticism, which I wrote in my 20s, there is a chapter called Speaking Silence, which is about this very, very topic. But sometimes, I mean, examples might be just the simplest possible poems. They are, you know, I'm often quoting, because I think it's so beautiful, the opening of a Hardy poem, The Self-Unseeing. Here is the ancient door, footworn and hollowed and thin. Here was the former door where the dead feet walked in. It can't get simpler than that. And yet every time I read it, unless I goof it up as I just did, I get shivers down my spine.
I was going to say we move on to the next reading, but I'm going to sneak a quick question in just on the back of what you've just said. Can you say a little about why some poetry sends a shiver up our spine and other leaves us cold, and vice versa for another person? I guess the same is true for music. What are your reflections on why those differences?
But I don't think it's necessarily that all poetry or all music should. As you know, Haussmann referred to it as a shaving test, that if when you say the words of this poem, it makes the bristles stand up, makes it easier to shave. But I think what's important there is that poetry, like music, is embodied, which is why it's so hopeless to sit in a seminar room and simply tear it apart into a bunch of abstract ideas and philosophies. Poetry makes your hair stand on end, it brings tears to your eyes, it quickens the pulse or does things to your blood pressure. And whether you're aware of it or not, when you're reading poetry, the syntax of it makes your skeletal musculature tense and relax. So it is a very, very physical thing. And I suppose I would say that some poetry doesn't do that. I don't think on the whole Milton does, but some poetry very clearly does. And I think being articulate about it is probably to destroy some of the beauty of it, so I won't say any more.
So let's go on to the next reading, Ian, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so this is the last reading, which is from page 171. It's about the nature of willing, which I think is the normal view of the of the left hemisphere, is that it wills things into being, it makes things happen, whereas the right hemisphere sees will, if it sees it at all, as being attracted to something and wanting to explore it. Our primary being lies in a disposition towards the world, certainly not in a thought or a whole panoply of thoughts about the world, not even in a feeling or feelings about the world as such. Willing, like believing, with which I think it shares some properties, is thus better thought of as a matter of a disposition towards the world. The left hemisphere disposition towards the world is that of use. Philosophy being a hyper-conscious cognitive process, it may be hard to get away from the left hemisphere's perspective that will is about control and must lie in the conscious left hemisphere. But if our disposition towards the world, our relationship with it alters, will has a different meaning. The disposition of the right hemisphere, the nature of its attention to the world, is one of care rather than control. Its will relates to a desire or longing towards something, something that lies beyond itself, towards the other. So that's the last piece. I can't hear you, Willem.
So just opening for questions, and I suggest we just we're okay for time. We have a period for questions on this reading, and if there are none, we'll move to see if there's any kind of broader questions for Ian on the wider book or any of his other ideas. So if people have any broader questions for Ian, here's one from Kay Wasfold. Does this speak to the process of personal transformation in mindfulness training or psychotherapeutic work?
I'm sure it does. I think the question's almost so general that I'm not sure quite what is being asked there. I'm happy to be prompted.
Kay, do you want to elaborate a bit on your question? We'll just see if Kay wants to come in before we go to the next one. So Kay's, it's the attitude of care rather than control that supports the transformative process in psychotherapeutic work, is her elaboration, I think.
Right. No, of course, I understand that. Yes, exactly. No, that is right. And broadly speaking, my view is that the attitude or disposition towards the world of the left hemisphere is to do with power. We have to have this disposition in order to get things, in order to eat, to build shelter, to survive in the world at all. But we also desperately need another kind of relation to the world, which is not that of manipulation. The left hemisphere wants to manipulate, to apprehend the world, and the right hemisphere is in the service of comprehending the world, of being open to it, whatever it is. So it has a fundamentally different, more receptive, rather than almost predatory attitude, which is that of the left hemisphere. And as a psychiatrist, I spent a lot of time helping people who felt that they should be able to control many things, to realize that letting go of the need to control and instead focusing on the exploration of a relationship with what is and finding a way of working with it and moving with it, rather as an expert surfer surfs a wave, rather than saying, I need the following kind of wave. I'm going to give you a countdown from 5 to 1, and then I want that wave to appear. A lot of people lead their lives very much in that way. So yes, I think a very important thing is to refocus on care, which is another way of saying relationship with the world in the very broadest sense. You know, and to let go of the need to control. I said this before and I'll say it again, but there is because I think it's so important, there's a wonderful saying by the early 20th century existentialist philosopher Louis Lavelle, which is La charité est une pure attention à l'existence d'autrui. In other words, love, la charité, is a pure attention to the existence of the other. I've never heard anything more profound about the nature of love or about the nature of attention, that really we owe it to whatever we are in relationship with, to pay attention. And often our relationships with people, with works of art, with thoughts and so on, founder because we're not really paying an open kind of attention. We're either not paying attention at all, or we're paying only fragmentary attention, or we're paying attention in order to control or produce an outcome. So I do think that's a very core, yeah, very important concept. Thanks very much.
So we have a number of further questions. We may not get through all of them. I just want to come to one of the panelists, Justine, who asks, do you see willing as like or different from intentionality? And how do they differ if so?
Is willing different from intentionality?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I think it is. I mean, of course, it depends how you use either term. And so we might get into a possibly not terribly fruitful business of trying to define what we exactly mean by willing and intentionality. But the distinction I think I would make is that there are different kinds of intentions. So somebody may intend to marry, to have a life partner, to have children. And that may be a very important intention. And it may actually govern what happens. But willing it to happen may result in it never happening because it's about putting yourself in a way for something to be, not about trying to force an outcome. So willing tends to be too, unless you already define will as something very much weaker than it's normally taken to mean. And it's really the difference between being pushed from behind and being drawn from in front, which is a distinction I make in the book when we talk about the sort of things that motivate us. We think of motivation as something that pushes us from behind because we always think these days of mechanistic trains of causation. But instead, I think of things that motivate us as things in front of us that are perhaps not fully seen, but to which we are drawn. And I think that love is like this. I think that spiritual things are like this. I believe that the great metaphors of religion are like this. I believe that all that is communicated by great art is like this. It draws us onwards to something that is never fully known, but in the process, we come always to know it a little better. So that's quite different from willing something, which, to refer back to something I said earlier, almost suggests that you already know what it is and you're therefore going to get it, which is a typical left hemisphere disposition. Whereas the being in relationship with something without, to quote Keats's famous phrase about negative capability, without irritably reaching out after fact or reason, to be able to stay in that uncertain place is a very important skill in life.
So we have 3 more questions. I'm going to suggest that's all we have time for. I'm going to ask this one next because it kind of relates to the one we just had, which is, how do you understand the will? I'm a psychologist, this person says very humbly, and psychologists don't really talk about the will.
Well, I mean, I suppose I've said what I tend to rather repeat what I've just said. So yeah, okay. I've nothing much to add on that. Yeah.
Okay. So the next question is about the body. And to what extent is sensing the body a way of opening up, the way of knowing that belongs to the right hemisphere?
Good question. In lots and lots of ways. I think we don't understand things unless we also understand them with the whole of us. There are more neurons in the human gut than there are in the brain of a dog, and a dog is by no means an unintelligent being. This is a bit of an embarrassment because a lot of them are not about controlling the gut. The majority of them are sending messages back to the brain. Why? And then when I was in medical school, there was another terrific embarrassment about the heart. There were what are called efferent fibers from the brain to the heart, telling it what to do. But there were a lot of fibers going back from the heart to the brain. What were they about? Well, it must be pain fibers. Well, there were some pain fibers, it's true, but there were also a lot of other fibers. So somehow the body is communicating with every other part of the body all the time. Being aware of that is a very important thing in itself, and it grounds one where one is in the present. So it's an important part of mindfulness. But also, there are more profuse connections between the right hemisphere and the right hemisphere's cortex and the right hemisphere limbic system than there are in the left hemisphere. And that's very important because it's a way in which reasoning and emotion are brought together. And there are also more profuse connections with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is the autonomic nervous system which governs things outside of our conscious control. So also, the right hemisphere is the part of us that has the body image in it, which is not at all just a visual image, but is, as it were, a multidimensional, multimodal sense of ourselves as an embodied being. So this connection between the body and the right hemisphere is very, very important one. And by moving more into a right hemispheric way of seeing things, if I can put it rather crudely like that, one is re-engaging with the body. And by re-engaging with the body, by which I don't mean just working out in the gym or something, but actually being aware of and inhabiting your body, is an important aspect of coming to a certain way of looking at the world.
So I said we only have just one more question, but I'm going to sneak in the other one as well, because it actually speaks to the question I asked before the break. So before the break, I asked you about why does some poetry and music leave us cold, and you answered it in terms of the music and the poetry. And I was actually thinking more about the person receiving the poetry and the music, which relates to this question. How does personal experience, for example, the experience of being in love or grief, enable more sensitive resonance with music, tingling bodily sensations and so on?
That's a beautiful question. And I think it's because probably of all the arts, music is best equipped both to explore sorrow and love. The most profound expressions are probably those in music. And they are intrinsically things that we feel are very deep and hard to articulate. Trying to explain what you mean and what you feel when you are in love in words is a dispiriting thing. And quite why one might have certain kinds of sorrow is also a thing that is a very deep thing. When I was training at the Maudsley, one of my mentors was the great Professor Alwyn Lishman, who was also a very good musician and a keen organist. And I remember him saying that the natural mode of music is that of sorrow. And I hadn't articulated it, but I had realized that. And when you listen to folk music from all over the world, yes, it has its jolly music for holidays and so on, thank goodness. But effectively, even then, it is shot through with a sort of melancholy. There is wonderful dance music up here in the Highlands and Islands, but it also is beautifully melancholy at the same time as life-enhancing. And actually, I think that the way in which we now tend to think and react to works of art has deprived us of something, which is the kind of relationship between sorrow and empathy. I mean, in a very technical sense, sorrow and empathy are related. Pathos is suffering. So sympathy and empathy are forms of suffering with. Mitleid, as the Germans say. So yes, at the moment, it seems to me that our responses to work of art are all to do with power. They're to do with it being strong, to being shocking, to being horrifying, or very blatant in some way. Whereas great works of art of the past, and great film even of the earlier part of the last century, explores this very, very rich realm of pathos, sadness and suffering, which somehow seems to have got driven out. Not entirely, of course, but it's been sidelined. And I think that's because actually it depends on sympathy, empathy, relationship, which are not the big things that we now build on in our society. We build on power, control, vying for position, not for kind of working with.
So the final question, and it's a question about you, which feels fitting. Do you have a preferred personal practice that supports you in experiencing through the right hemisphere's way of knowing?
Well, yes, 2 or 3 very simple things. One is mindfulness, which is, or at least my understanding of mindfulness, which may not be what you understand, Willem, but it's the best I do. So I think that is very important, just silence actually, and prayer. There are 1 or 2 prayers that I think are extraordinarily deep and that I recur to very often and then listen in the silence. And I also enjoy very much and get a lot from listening to music and reading poetry. So those things have never left my life. Indeed, one of the reasons I decided not to carry on in academia was because I loved poetry too much. I didn't want to be operating on my friends or my life.
Just before I hand back to Kate to close up the session, I just want to thank you personally and on behalf of everyone, Iain. It's been a huge privilege to have a chance to be in dialogue with you like this. So thank you very much, and just hand you back over to Kate.
Thank you very much indeed, all of you. And for wonderful questions, by the way.
And my thanks too to Willem for sharing and to Iain for your wonderful insights. I felt it was like watching Roger Federer taking on all comers and creating beautiful rallies, dazzling rallies with each person. So it was very thought-provoking and illuminating. This recording will be online on our webpage. You can also find the readings there, the 4 readings that Iain read out. And you can find on our website as well the podcast that I mentioned, and there will be more details of what's coming up. Thank you very much for spending this time with us and for supporting us. We really appreciate it. The next slide that you see will show a link to the Silence Hub web pages and also to Iain's channel. So do follow that link to find out more. Thank you very much and good afternoon.